So recently posted a clip from an interview I did on the Protestant Libertarian podcast, and there was a just kind of a quick little reference I made to the idea that the New Testament teaches nonviolence um, or pacifism, and I got a comment from somebody who had said, "Well, the New Testament doesn't really teach that." So I said, "Well, okay, well, what about these few verses?" And just mentioned a few that were kind of maybe the most cited verses on that topic. And so he gave his kind of responses, and which I appreciate. And so I wanted to give a quick response as well. Hope it will be instructive for y'all as well as for the original poster. So here we go.
Romans 12 basically breaks down, bless those who persecute you, do not repay evil for evil. This is referring more or less to taking revenge on somebody wronging you because you are a Christian.
With Romans 12, I think he's reading something into the text that's not there in order to limit the principle because he doesn't want to apply it universally. So, is Romans 12 only about taking revenge on someone who wrongs you because you're a Christian? No, it says never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will reap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So, the word revenge is used, but the vengeance is also used in Romans 13 when it describes the function of the state. That the state is an avenger for God, at least that's how it's supposed to work, to punish evildoers and not the good, right? Of course, oftentimes they do punish the good, but that's not what that's not how it's supposed to work. Um, so what Paul is saying is don't use violence against those who want to harm you. Don't respond and retaliate with violence. Um, show kindness and mercy and love, and give room for God to use wrath, whether that's through the state or through some other means, or even just final judgment. So it's you can talk about the revenge aspect, which is certainly in the text, but the idea that it's only about someone wronging you because you are a Christian is not in the text. Paul is basically saying, how the state uses violence, how the state uses the sword. We don't do that. That's the contrast.
Matthew 38 through 44. Again, more about revenge. Eye for an eye. That is revenge, not defense.
So in his response here, he says that Matthew 5 is about revenge and not defense. In another place later in the video, he also says that turning the other cheek is about insults and not attacks. And, I've read commentaries on Matthew that emphasize the shame aspect of this passage, that, the Roman, it's probably a Roman soldier who's in view here who is backhanding a Jew. That's why the significance of which cheek is being slapped. And so, yeah, there's an element of shame here. It's not self-defense, probably, in the sense that the Jew is about to be killed, but there is a question of what the appropriate response is when someone does violence to you. Because, yes, violence is, kind of the key component here. It's not someone who's saying something mean. It's somebody who is slapping you. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, this is an aspect of legal justice in the Jewish context. And so he's quoting here from the Torah, from the law of Moses. And this is a limiting principle. So the idea was, you can't, in legal justice, you can't exact more punishment than what was done to the offender, right? But Jesus says, I'm going to go further than that. I'm doing away with that in one sense, and I'm giving you a different principle. That principle is, do not resist an evil person. And resist can have this kind of connotation of, a physical force, violence, opposition. So do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. But yes, this is not just about an insult. This is about violence and how you respond to it.
First Peter is referring to that you will be rewarded for suffering unfairly because of your faith. This is not in any way explicitly telling anybody that you are not allowed to defend yourself in the event of an attack.
First Peter 2, he contends or asserts that this is really, once again, only about suffering because of your faith. And that Peter is not saying that you can't defend yourself during an attack. Well, is that what Peter actually says? Well, Peter starts by talking about how Christians should respond to the state, that we should, um, um, do good and be willing to sort of acquiesce to the state whenever possible, um, in order to silence the ignorance of foolish men, people who will look at Christians and say, these are bad people, they're lawless, whatever. So Peter says, well, submit to the state. There are, of course, limits to that because Peter doesn't always do it himself. But as a general principle, he believes that should be done. And the reason it should be done is because it silences opposition to the gospel. But then he goes on to talk about slaves. And he says to slaves, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if, for the sake of conscience towards God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are treated harshly, you endure it with patience? But if you do what is right and you suffer for it, you patiently endure it. This finds favor with God. So Peter is not limiting this to being suffering for your faith. He's talking about a slave who is a Christian. The master may or may not identify as a Christian, probably not based on how he's acting. But Peter says, if you have if you're in this sort of situation, much like the state, where you have someone who's over you, who's treating you unjustly, that it could be glorifying to God to suffer through that for the cause of glorifying God and showing the goodness of the gospel and the evil wickedness of the person who's oppressing you. Peter then goes on to say that when we do this, we're following Christ's example. Quote, for you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. So Peter is saying the way that Jesus behaved toward the Roman authorities is the way we should behave in regular aspects of our lives, right? Not just, oh, well, you're a missionary in this country and you get to die as a martyr. And in this one example where maybe you can choose to be a martyr for Christ, that's when you respond nonviolently. That's this kind of weird limiting principle that you sometimes get from statists. When it's time to be a martyr, then sure, but not generally. No, but Peter is saying we follow Christ's example in other aspects of our lives, in our other relationships, and that's something we do consistently.
John 18:36, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by Jewish leaders. This is Jesus himself saying that, hey, my kingdom is spiritual. If my kingdom was on earth, I would condone my followers fighting to protect me from the Jewish leaders. This is not in any way preventing a Christian from owning and using any kind of self-defense.
We move on to John 18:36. This is where Jesus is asked by Pilate if he's this king, where are his subjects? Why aren't they there to stop him from being executed? And Jesus responds, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Okay, so many people say, well, Jesus is only willing to suffer because he has this one specific goal, um, which is to be crucified in order to save sinners. If it wasn't for that, Jesus would be out there, whipping tail, right? Well, that's not what Jesus says. Jesus says the reason that his servants aren't fighting is because his kingdom is not of this realm or of this world. Okay? So what that means is, well, when you have a physical kingdom, you defend it with physical force. Jesus says, well, I don't have a physical kingdom right now. I have a spiritual kingdom. And so, as Paul says in other places, the fight isn't against flesh and blood and the weapons aren't carnal. The response that's given here, that it's about Jesus preventing his followers from fighting to protect him from the Jewish leaders, is another example of trying to sort of limit the focus of the passage from its kind of more broad connotation. But yes, it is about Jesus preventing his followers from fighting, and in this case, to protect him from the Jewish leaders. He goes on to say it doesn't prevent Christians from using self defense. Well, technically, it's not a self defense passage, it's a defense of others passage. Jesus says, even to save me, they're not going to come in here like rebels and start slashing with a sword. I won't play the clips, but he goes on to talk about this passage in Luke 22 about buying a sword. I'm not going to play the clips because I've already dealt with that, and I frequently asked questions to about Christian anarchism video that you can go back and watch. He also gives an account from Nehemiah of national defense, which once again, Israel is a physical nation, so I don't have an issue with the fact that when Israel was a physical nation, God was okay with using physical force to defend it. But as Jesus says in John 18:36, my kingdom is not now of this world, so it's not really relevant.
As Christians, we are not called to be the ultimate pacifists. We are called to be peacekeepers. We are called to keep the peace and seek peace. But when trouble comes knocking, God doesn't expect us to just lay down and die.
When trouble comes knocking, God doesn't expect us to lay down and die. I mean, that's what pick up your cross means, isn't it? I mean, yeah, of course we're supposed to lay down and die. When Christ calls us, he calls us to die. So to me, this is a, wanting to hold on to the gospel message, but not wanting it to really, wanting its, extreme call to discipleship to really shape our lives. Yeah, when God calls us, when he bids us to come and die, to pick up our cross. So I think trying to hold on to our lives at all costs here is really antithetical to the gospel message.
I would also like to pose a simple moral question. Somebody has broken into your house and is threatening your wife and family. As a man and a husband, a godly man and godly husband, you are called to be the provider and protector of your family. Is it ungodly to use force to protect your wife and child? I don't think so.
Simple moral question. Someone breaks into your house. If you're a godly man and husband, you're called to protect your family. Thus, you would think that it would not be ungodly to use force to protect. So yeah, this is a fair question. It's a real question. I don't deny the force of the question. I think I always want to start with what Scripture has to say because I'm a Christian, so that's my starting point. But I can acknowledge that I might be tempted to disobey Scripture based on other values or concerns that I have, right, or lack of faith or trust or whatever. So I don't know. So let's broaden this a little bit. Is it ungodly to steal to feed your family? It's ungodly to steal, right? That's a sin. But you could say, well, someone who steals to feed their family, at least you get it. It makes sense. You can put yourself in that situation and understand it. Or let's say like a trolley car scenario. You can divert a train away from your child, one that's going to run him over, but it's going to kill another child, right? So would that be godly to protect your child and kill another child? once again, I think you would get it, you would understand it. But would you call it godly? Eh. And so, what I'm saying, to back up here, um, I don't think that physical force is always wrong. Um, I've had to hold down my kids so they can get a shot that they needed or medicine that they needed. And I don't think that physical force was not in their best interest. That physical force was in their best interest. So I was okay with that. Um, um, Now, the question is, if I'm in a situation where I might have an easy opportunity to kill somebody, who I think poses some kind of a threat, is that going to be something I'm going to do and intend to do? Am I going to try to kill someone on purpose? And I think the answer to that question is, well, if I'm supposed to love my enemies, is it loving to kill someone who is in the process of sinning and probably then to send them to hell? And I would say the answer to that is no, it's not loving to do that. It is loving, of course, to try to protect other people. But I would say that the ideal solution that every Christian should try to achieve is to find a way to love their enemies while also loving those whom they love and naturally and want to protect. That would be the ideal scenario. is uh, is God going to be understanding if you kill someone to protect other people? You know, I think so. I mean, that was Bonhoeffer's dilemma, right? He said, well, it would be wrong essentially for me to try to kill Hitler, but it would also be wrong for me to sort of stand aside and do nothing. So if I participate in this campaign to kill Hitler, maybe that's, something I can just rely on God's grace for. I'm in a position where there's not an easy answer. There's no solution that seems perfect. So what I'm going to do is make the best decision I think I can make, and then rely on the grace of God. And so I'm not trying to be a legalist here, but I am saying, these are principles. You love your enemies, and I think loving your enemies means you don't kill them. And that should be at the very least, the intention and the goal that we strive for. And I don't think that we, can just sort of wave that off and say, well, um, it doesn't matter. It's not a bad thing. It's not something we should try to avoid because, you know, because I'm a manly man with a responsibility or whatever.